and that is Tim, and that is Audrey. That's me. So that has to be
Six. And what was life like as the kid?
Oh, he was the meanest. He teased the life out of us, and he was off a poor Finn. And I can remember Granny saying, "If Finn grows up and murders somebody, it'll be your fault."
Well, he got all the attention. That's what used to bother me. Like Malcolm in later years. Oh, Malcolm, Jesus, you know, the next thing to God's nephews. I was the guy picking the apples up over the trees. I was the guy that was scraping the manure off the...
Yes, and you were the guy that went to the private school. You were the guy that went out hunting with Grandpa.
Yeah.
And you were the guy, you know, you had all kinds of advantages. Then the Depression came along. All of a sudden,
Fenn never
we had nothing.
Fenn never got into the shooting trips, so he never got shot like I did.
How did life change when the Depression came along?
Well, before the Depression, we had
Doing very well.
We were doing very well. Two maids and a nurse for the babies, and then when the war came along, Granny started raising hens, and they even had pigs.
They even had a pig. Percival Pig.
One pig.
He had a name, Percival.
And so Granny, for someone that grew up in the city, she adapted to country life.
I loved it.
Extremely
So
well.
I don't think she'd ever heated water before. And then she turned into a wonderful cook.
She gardened, she raised hens, chickens, and she just became a country person. And it was amazing. We just didn't have
I
we
think
didn't have
Mother
things.
wrote to Grandpa Scarf and just asked if he could keep the show on the road here in Ross
And
Lake.
he did.
And I think he sent her money regularly.
We ran up a bill at the local grocery store that didn't get paid off until, I don't know when.
Years later.
Years later.
Now, where was Harold Ellis at this time?
He was home. He was home, but
He went to town every day.
He had different odd jobs.
People like Clarence Beveridge would say, "Look, the office is in a mess, Harold. Come in and see if you can straighten the thing up for me."
And then he worked for the Red Cross, and but for pittance, you know.
The trouble was he had been a stockbroker, and nobody was buying stock because they didn't trust any stock, and they didn't particularly trust stockbrokers. Afterward, people would say, "Never leave your stock certificates with your broker, because he'll cash them in to save his own skin." And that's what happened. So anyway, Dad didn't have any money in the stock market. He never lost any money in the stock market. He lost his livelihood. That's what he lost.
He was the youngest of three boys, quite a bit younger than his two brothers.
He loved to play cards, and he was
Told
he was
stories.
probably the best duck shooter around here. When he was an old man, a bunch of fellas, younger men, took him on a duck shooting expedition up on the Sackville Marshes. And as he told me, he said, "I was somebody's responsibility. They were there to make sure I didn't get in any trouble." He said, 2 ducks came in over decoys, and I dropped one, I dropped the other one, and they just, the whole bunch had never seen anything done so fast. So they realized they didn't have a greenhorn with them.
Because we would drive down to New River Beach, and there was always a place on the old road, and I still see it when I go in the old road, where we had to stop, and Granny would get this look on her face, and Dad would have to go into this little shack.
Frank Totten.
Frank
Frank
Totten's.
Totten.
Yeah, he had to go in there for something. We never knew what he was in there for, but he went in. He was a bootlegger, and he went in to get a drink.
But when you came down the other side, that's where Frank Totten
Yeah.
had his shack. Well, I used to take one afternoon off a week and work as a linesman for a man who was doing a survey of Rossi Park. He'd look through the transit and I'd hold the rod, and then he'd get me to hold one end of the steel tape. We'd measure from one peg to another, and I made a little money out of that and gave it to Mother to help
And
out.
Fenn sold magazines, and,
Yeah.
magazine subscriptions.
And eggs, that's a strange thing. That eggs were 60 cents a dozen. I can remember that as well as anything. These big brown Rhode Island red eggs.
Yeah.
Well, I think at the end of the war they were still only about 60 cents a dozen.
I don't think
Everything else had gone up sky high. Milk had, God, when milk went from 8 cents to 10, the dairy down here said, well, people, they just wouldn't pay.
We skated down at the rink down here. We skied. I remember I had a pair of skis that just had a strap across.
We had
and you put your feet
snowshoes.
in. Yeah, and we skied on Taylor's Hill, which was just behind our house. You skied, and they had, some of the boys had ice boats.
Ice boats.
And, we
And
were
they
on the
cut
river.
holes in the ice and fish for smelt.
Really?
And
What was the ice boat all about? What was that?
well, it was like a sailboat on skates.
Okay.
Oh, no,
Oh,
there
right.
wasn't-
It
there
was a
wasn't-
cross, just a
Yeah.
cross.
That's just
A
thing.
great big plank, and then back about a quarter of the way was a cross piece, and then the cross piece had underneath it a block with an iron
Blade.
skate,
Yeah.
and steered and go. They'd
Wow.
go about 60 miles an hour down the ice,
Oh, there were lots of trains. There were lots of
and
trains.
they would come in on time.
And we didn't have buses then, but people put chains on their back tires.
Right.
But
there
there
were
was a
horses.
man who used to come with a horse, pulling a V-type plow, and he'd come up our driveway and go around the house. All the houses in Rossy that are old either have a driveway that goes around the house or a crescent-shaped driveway that goes in and back out, because a horse couldn't back up a snowplow. It could only go ahead.
Right. So it needed to
And
be a loop.
anyway, and the same way with a wagon, how are you going to turn a wagon? You'd have to back it up into the flower bed to get it turned. So the thing to do is make the driveway so you never have to turn. You just keep going. And in practically every house along here, you'll see the curved driveway. Or
Yeah.